Looking back at World War II history, we often focus on the famous trials that followed, Nuremberg, Tokyo, and countless military tribunals where the perpetrators of the Third Reich's crimes faced formal justice. These trials were meticulously documented, their proceedings recorded for posterity, their verdicts entered into the official record of human history. But there exists another, darker chapter of accountability that rarely appears in textbooks or museum exhibits. This is the story of those who never reached the courtroom. It is the account of unofficial justice meted out by partisans in the forests, Red Army soldiers on the front lines, liberated concentration camp prisoners, and civilians who had witnessed unspeakable horrors visited upon their families and communities. This documentary explores the documented cases of summary executions, revenge killings, and extrajudicial punishments that occurred during and immediately after the war. These are not stories of legal proceedings, but rather of raw human response to systematic brutality, actions born from grief, rage, and the primal need for immediate retribution. What follows is based on military reports, partisan diaries, eyewitness testimonials, and declassified documents from Soviet archives. These events represent a complex moral landscape where the lines between justice and vengeance became irreversibly blurred. To understand the actions described in this documentary, one must first comprehend the scale and nature of atrocities committed by the occupying forces across the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. Between 1941 and 1945, the Eastern Front became a theater of unparalleled brutality. Villages were systematically destroyed. Civilian populations were subjected to mass elimination campaigns. Women and children were not spared from the violence. The occupying forces, along with their collaborators, implemented policies of collective punishment that turned entire regions into landscapes of death. For those who witnessed these crimes, Red Army soldiers returning to find their villages in ashes, partisans operating in territories where the population had been decimated, and prisoners emerging from camps where death was an industrial process, the psychological impact was profound and transformative. The official Soviet military doctrine emphasized the taking of prisoners for intelligence purposes. However, the reality on the ground often diverged sharply from official policy. When soldiers discovered what had been done to their families, when partisans found entire communities wiped out, when survivors emerged from captivity, bearing the physical and psychological scars of their imprisonment, the impulse for immediate retribution frequently overrode military discipline. Military records from the Red Army contain numerous accounts of soldiers who, after learning of atrocities committed against their families, became unable to fulfill their duties regarding the capture of enemy personnel for intelligence gathering. One particularly documented case involves a reconnaissance soldier named Tikhonov, whose story appears in a 1942 report from his military unit. Tikhonov had been an effective and reliable operative, successfully capturing enemy soldiers for interrogation. However, this changed abruptly when news reached him about the fate of his home village. The settlement where his family lived had been subjected to a brutal reprisal action. The civilian population had been subjected to extreme violence. Tikhonov learned that his sister, or possibly multiple sisters according to varying accounts, had been violated before being killed along with other residents. From that moment forward, according to the military report, Tikhonov was unable to deliver captured enemy soldiers alive. Despite repeated orders and reprimands, any prisoner he took would be found dead, having been beaten with fists until they expired. The report's clinical language cannot mask the personal tragedy that transformed a disciplined soldier into someone driven purely by the need for vengeance. Tikhonov's case was far from unique. Throughout the Soviet military records, similar incidents appear. Soldiers who, after receiving devastating news from home, could no longer separate their military duty from their personal grief. As the Red Army pushed westward and began liberating territories that had been under occupation, one of the most volatile situations involved the identification of collaborators who had participated in atrocities against the local population. Following the liberation of Belarus, one particularly notable incident was documented with unusual detail. The Red Army had requisitioned local labor to construct a military airfield. Among the workers was a peasant who stood out for his exceptional diligence and work ethic. While others took breaks or worked at a moderate pace, this man labored tirelessly, seemingly eager to prove his loyalty to the returning Soviet forces. However, some of the local villagers from the surrounding settlements, Lishny, Shpakovsy, Teshivali, Tyuchnevichi, began to observe this worker more carefully. Something about his mannerisms, his appearance, seemed familiar in a deeply disturbing way. Eventually, recognition came. The hard-working peasant was identified as a former guard from the Kolyevo concentration camp, a facility where approximately 22,000 Soviet citizens had perished. The camp had been one of numerous sites where systematic elimination of prisoners had taken place through starvation, harsh conditions, and direct elimination. When the identification was made, the local residents did not immediately call for formal military justice. Instead, they physically restrained the man themselves. A lieutenant who was passing nearby was informed of the situation. According to the documented account, the officer made a swift decision. He ordered his soldiers to bind the former guard to the tail of a horse. The horse was then sent galloping across the construction site of the airfield. The body of the guard was dragged across the terrain, torn apart by the violent motion. This incident was officially recorded in military documents, though it received no formal investigation or disciplinary action. In the context of the time and place where the local population had directly suffered under this man's actions, where 22,000 deaths were attributed to the facility where he had served, the lieutenant's decision apparently did not merit official censure. Perhaps one of the most horrifying documented incidents involves a tank platoon that captured a village under cover of darkness. The garrison surrendered with minimal resistance, and the prisoners were placed in a barn while their fate was being decided. When the tank crew opened the barn doors to check on the prisoners, they encountered a scene that would haunt them permanently. 2 horizontal beams had been installed across the barn's interior. On one beam, children of various ages had been hanged. Opposite them, on the second beam, domestic animals, cats and dogs, had been similarly hanged. The children had been arranged in descending order by height. The tallest child was positioned first, then progressively smaller children, creating a grotesque display. The animals opposite them had been arranged in the same manner. While the officers stood in shock, processing what they were witnessing, one of the tank drivers took action on his own initiative. Without orders, he started his tank's engine and drove the vehicle directly into the group of prisoners. The tank's treads crushed several of the captives instantly. After the children and animals were removed and buried in a common grave, the surviving prisoners were forced to carry the crushed bodies back into the barn. The remaining captives were driven inside as well. The barn was then destroyed by fire from the tank's main gun. No disciplinary action was taken against the tank crew. The official report merely noted the incident as part of the village's liberation. For the partisan units operating behind enemy lines, the question of prisoners presented unique challenges. Operating in forests with limited supplies and constant threat of discovery, partisan commanders faced practical constraints that regular military units did not. Additional mouths to feed represented a genuine security and logistical burden. Consequently, captured enemy soldiers were frequently subject to immediate field execution rather than being held or transported. However, some partisans developed more elaborate methods of dealing with their captives, particularly when those captives had been involved in particularly heinous actions against civilians. One documented method employed during winter months involved stripping captured enemy soldiers completely and performing a symbolic mutilation before leaving the body to freeze. The frozen corpse would then be positioned prominently near a roadway with a sign attached bearing crude insults. This served both as revenge and as psychological warfare against remaining occupation forces. The partisan approach to prisoners often correlated directly with the level of atrocities the enemy unit had committed. When partisans captured members of units that had engaged in particularly brutal reprisal actions, such as burning villages with inhabitants still inside, the partisans would sometimes replicate these methods against their captives. Forest clearings would become execution sites, where captured personnel from punitive units and local collaborators would be burned alive, mirroring the fate they had inflicted on villages. The partisan logic was straightforward. Those who burned civilians alive had forfeited any claim to humane treatment. Another common method of execution in partisan-controlled areas was drowning in swamps and marshes. This method had several advantages from the partisan perspective. It required no expenditure of ammunition, which was perpetually in short supply. It left no trace that could be easily discovered, and it was considered by the partisans to be an appropriate ignominious end for collaborators and occupiers. Partisan forces also developed a particularly grim form of execution involving minefields. Captured enemy soldiers would be forced to run through mined areas until all had been killed by detonations. This practice emerged as a direct response to the occupying forces' policy of forcing civilian populations to walk through minefields to clear roads, a practice that killed countless innocent people. Not all resistance fighters operated under formal command structures or followed military regulations. Throughout the occupied territories, groups of so-called wild partisans operated independently. These were typically local residents who had taken up arms after witnessing atrocities against their communities, operating outside the organized partisan movement's chain of command. For these irregular fighters, the rules of warfare held little meaning. Their approach to captured enemy personnel was driven purely by vengeance, and they considered quick execution to be insufficiently punitive for those who had participated in atrocities. Soviet writer Sheremet, in a report submitted to Nikita Khrushchev in 1943, documented some of the practices he witnessed among partisan units. He specifically noted the actions of partisans under the command of Fedorov, where he observed captured collaborators being subjected to prolonged physical punishment before execution. Sheremet's account describes scenes of extreme violence. Individuals beaten until they bled profusely, subjected to cutting with knives, having their hair set on fire, being tied by the feet and dragged behind horses through forests, and having boiling liquid poured over them. The report noted that under Fedorov's command, enemy captives were subjected to systematic physical punishment before execution. The diary of Balitsky, commander of a partisan detachment bearing Stalin's name, provides further documentation. In one entry, he describes how suspected infiltrators and spies were treated upon capture. After personally interrogating one suspected spy in the early morning, Belitsky notes that other partisans gathered and beat the man to death using clubs. The body was subjected to further violence and had boiling water poured over it. That same day, according to Belitsky's diary, a local mayor who had collaborated with the occupiers was brought to the partisan headquarters. By evening, he too was dead, beaten by multiple partisans using whatever implements were at hand, and also subjected to scolding. Some partisan units developed execution methods that served dual purposes, eliminating captives and creating psychological impact on the occupying forces and potential collaborators. In one documented incident in the villages of the Dolgo-Shelchansky district, partisans captured an enemy detachment. Rather than simply executing the prisoners, the partisans devised the public spectacle. Gallows were erected in a line. The prisoners were hanged, but the gallows were positioned near horses. Irritants were applied to the horses' tails, causing them to bolt and drag the gallows and hanging bodies, creating a mobile display of execution. This gruesome performance had its intended effect. For residents who might have considered collaborating with the occupation forces, the message was unmistakably clear and terrifyingly memorable. In another documented case, near the settlement of Glushevka, partisans captured a group of 23 local collaborator police. Rather than executing all of them directly, the partisan commander exploited the captives' fear and self-preservation instincts. The commander announced to the prisoners, "There are too many of you. We don't need this many. Only half of you will come with us to camp. Figure out among yourselves who continues and who stays here. There are enough logs in this barn for that purpose." The prisoners were then locked in the barn with pieces of firewood. The captives, desperate to be among the survivors, turned on each other, beating their fellow prisoners to death with the logs in a desperate attempt to reduce their numbers and secure their own survival. When the partisan fighters opened the barn later, they found the results of this forced self-destruction. The survivors were not, in fact, taken to any camp. They were simply executed on the spot. The partisan commander had never intended to spare anyone. He had simply wanted to spare his own ammunition while inflicting maximum psychological torture. Execution by bayonet was another documented practice, particularly among irregular partisan units. Though regular partisan forces sometimes employed this method as well. One particularly detailed account comes from a partisan unit where the question of how to deal with prisoners was put to a vote among the fighters. When one partisan suggested bayoneting the captives, the commander asked for a volunteer to carry out the execution. A partisan named Selezniev stepped forward. The occupying forces had burned his entire family alive in a reprisal action. According to the documented account, Selezniev methodically approached each prisoner individually, ordered them to lie on the ground, and then killed each one with multiple bayonet strikes. No one in the partisan unit questioned or criticized this action. In the context of personal loss and the brutality they had all witnessed, Selezniev's volunteering was understood as a form of personal closure. When partisan units identified enemy agents who had infiltrated their ranks posing as genuine resistance fighters, a different approach was typically employed. Open execution of suspected infiltrators could alert other potential spies that their cover had been compromised, potentially allowing them to escape or send warning. Instead, partisan units typically handled confirmed infiltrators quietly. The suspected agents would be allowed to continue normally for a brief period while their identity was verified. Once confirmation was obtained, the infiltrator would either have poison added to their food or would have their throat cut silently during the night. The death would appear natural or accidental to any other potential infiltrators in the unit.
Perhaps surprisingly, some of the most elaborate and systematic extrajudicial killings of former enemy personnel occurred in the American occupation zone following Germany's surrender. Major Mayer Behrens organized what became known as death squads, unofficial units composed of soldiers, many of whom had lost family members in camps. Behrens himself was driven by the desire to exact revenge for the elimination of Jewish communities. The total number of individuals killed by these squads remains unknown, though some American historians estimate several thousand. The methods employed were deliberately varied and theatrical. Individuals were thrown from windows, accompanied by whistling and jeering. Some were drowned. Others were killed by hand grenades or had their throats cut. These squads operated with apparent impunity in the immediate post-war chaos, targeting identified perpetrators of atrocities before they could be processed through official channels. Beyond these organized squads, regular American soldiers also engaged in unauthorized punishment of captured enemy personnel. This was particularly true for tank crews. The 1st German Tank Corps had inflicted devastating losses on American forces in the Ardennes in 1944, and this created lasting animosity. While approximately 100 captured tank crew members were officially tried and executed by military tribunal, many others died before reaching trial. Documented accounts describe severe physical punishment. Captives were beaten, forced to consume urine, made to lick up saliva from floors, and subjected to crushing of extremities and other sensitive areas. Many died from head injuries inflicted during interrogations. One of the most grimly appropriate punishments for camp personnel involved forcing them to handle the very evidence of their crimes. Guards and administrators from elimination facilities were compelled to move and bury the bodies of victims, often in advanced states of decomposition, without any protective equipment. This work, performed without gloves, masks, or protective clothing, resulted in many of the former perpetrators contracting fatal infections. Others died from what the medical reports termed cadaveric poisoning, systemic toxicity from exposure to decomposing remains. From a certain perspective, this form of punishment contained a dark symmetry. Those who had created mountains of dead were forced to physically confront and handle the results of their actions until those same dead claimed their lives through disease and contamination. When concentration camps were liberated, either by advancing armies or through prisoner uprisings, the guards and administrators who had not already fled sometimes fell into the hands of those they had brutalized. These encounters rarely resulted in the captors being held for official justice. The prisoners, who had endured years of systematic dehumanization, starvation, forced labor, and witnessed countless deaths, did not wait for tribunals. Without access to weapons, the liberated prisoners used whatever was at hand. Shovels and wooden clubs became instruments of retribution. Guards were drowned in wells, strangled with ropes, had their throats crushed under the feet of the crowds, had their skulls broken with stones. Some guards were nailed alive to posts and then stoned to death by crowds of former prisoners. Women guards and administrators faced particular fury from female prisoners, with documented cases of guards literally being torn apart by groups of survivors. In some instances, the cruel irony was complete. Guards were placed into the very mechanisms of punishment they had operated. Punishment frames designed for beatings were used to restrain the guards while they were beaten to death by those they had once controlled. A particular fate awaited members of the Russian Liberation Army, Soviet citizens who had defected to fight alongside German forces under General Andrei Vlasov. When the war ended, Allied forces, pursuant to agreements made at Yalta, returned these individuals to Soviet authority.
Many attempted to flee or resist this forced repatriation, knowing what awaited them. Documented reports indicate that some groups of these returnees who attempted escape were simply crushed by tanks rather than being recaptured. The Soviet view of these individuals as traitors left little room for procedural niceties. These documented incidents represent a fraction of the unofficial justice meted out during and after World War II. For every case that was recorded in a military report, partisan diary, or official document, countless others occurred without documentation, witnessed only by those directly involved. It is crucial to understand that these actions did not occur in a vacuum. They were responses to a campaign of systematic brutality that had killed tens of millions of civilians and prisoners. The perpetrators and their collaborators had participated in or enabled crimes of unprecedented scale. The industrial elimination of entire communities, the deliberate starvation of millions, the transformation of vast territories into zones of death. Those who enacted this unofficial justice, the soldiers who learned their families had been destroyed, the partisans operating in forests where entire villages had been eliminated, the concentration camp survivors emerging from years of torture and dehumanization, were not acting from abstract political ideology. They were responding to concrete, personal loss and to witnessed horror that defied comprehension. Yet acknowledging the understandable human impulse behind these actions does not resolve the moral complexity they present. Summary executions, no matter how understandable the motivation, represent abandonment of the legal and moral frameworks that supposedly distinguish civilization from barbarism. The official trials, Nuremberg and others, were established precisely to create an alternative to this cycle of revenge. They represented an attempt to respond to unprecedented evil with unprecedented justice, systematic, documented, and bound by legal procedure. The trials were imperfect, and many guilty parties escaped justice entirely, but they established a precedent that atrocities would be addressed through law rather than through unlimited retaliation. The unofficial justice of World War II's Eastern Front and its aftermath reveals the limits of human restraint in the face of extreme atrocity. It demonstrates that legal frameworks and military discipline can break down when individuals are confronted with the destruction of everything they held dear. These accounts also reveal an uncomfortable truth. The line between justice and vengeance becomes razor-thin when the crimes are of such magnitude that existing moral and legal categories seem inadequate to address them. How does one formally prosecute crimes committed on such a scale? How does one weigh individual culpability when millions participated in or enabled systematic elimination? How does one address personal loss when entire families, entire villages, entire populations have been destroyed? The perpetrators who died at the hands of partisans, soldiers, and liberated prisoners never faced the courtrooms where major war criminals were tried. They never heard the charges read against them, never had the opportunity for defense, never received formal sentencing. Their deaths were swift, often brutal, and utterly devoid of legal procedure. Yet to the soldiers who had returned to find their villages burned and their families dead, to the partisans who had watched their communities systematically destroyed, to the concentration camp survivors who had witnessed daily horrors that defied description, these men had already been tried, convicted, and sentenced by their own actions. This documentary has examined a dark chapter of World War II history that is rarely discussed in detail. These events challenge our comfortable narratives about justice, morality, and the rule of law. They force us to confront what happens when the normal frameworks of civilization collapse under the weight of industrialized atrocity. The unofficial justice of 1941 to 1945 was not the product of careful jurisprudence or measured legal philosophy. It was the raw, immediate response of people who had suffered beyond the capacity of language to describe and beyond the capacity of law to adequately address. Whether we call these actions understandable justice or inexcusable vengeance depends on a moral calculation that each person must make for themselves. What remains indisputable is that these events occurred, were documented, and form an essential part of understanding the complete reality of World War II. They remind us that beyond the famous trials and the official proceedings, there existed another form of reckoning, one written not in legal briefs and judgments, but in the forests, fields, and ruins of a continent that had been transformed into a landscape of death. The lesson, if there is one to extract from these grim accounts, may be this: the creation and maintenance of systems of justice, however imperfect, serves a purpose beyond the simple administration of punishment. They prevent the descent into limitless cycles of revenge. They create space for distinction between individual guilt and collective punishment. They establish that even the worst criminals possess certain irreducible rights that separate civilization from barbarism. When those systems break down or prove inadequate to the scale of crimes committed, what remains is what we have examined here: humans reduced to their most basic impulses, enacting immediate and personal justice according to their own measures. This is not the justice of courtrooms and legal precedent. It is the justice of survivors, of witnesses, of those who suffered beyond measure and found themselves with the power to respond in kind. These events remain part of the historical record, uncomfortable reminders of what humans are capable of doing to each other and what those who survive such treatment are capable of doing in response. They are neither to be celebrated nor ignored, but rather to be understood as part of the complete picture of humanity's darkest conflict. Subscribe to the channel for more historical documentaries exploring the untold stories of World War II.